The question is that the House take note of the petition. I call the member for Barwon.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. First, let me make one thing clear. I firmly believe that cruelty to animals is not on. There can be no excuse to willfully mistreat any animal. People who do so are often the worst kind of humans, the kind who try to make up for their own inadequacies by taking it out on creatures over which they have too much power and can't take legal action against them. Although sometimes the animals can give the person a good bite, a kick or a spray, sometimes people learn their lessons, but there are those who will be cruel regardless. And that's why we need legislation to protect animals from the worst that humans can dish out. We need laws to define the boundaries that should not be crossed, but those boundaries need to be properly defined and not left too broad. That is the problem with the discussed changes to the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act. The changes mentioned in the discussion paper are too drastic and introduce to the animal rights agenda a definition of what cruelty means. The introduction of the 5 freedoms of animals, the changing of the definition of cruelty, the overarching concept of harm, and for the first time also the inclusion of psychological suffering as a form of animal cruelty. It makes any interaction with the animal potentially fall within the ambit of POCTA. Under the terms discussed, the 5 freedoms will become mandatory obligations to be met by anyone interacting with animals. There will be a positive obligation under the Act and therefore a requirement the aspirations of animal rights organisations will become the minimum standards. Further, the penalties will be significantly increased. Again, I just want to make it clear, I don't think animals should be distressed, infuriated, tormented, terrified or traumatised into submission. When it comes to training animals, you mostly get better results with the carrot than the stick. That is with positive reinforcement over punishment. But there is an obvious problem with trying to frame the concept of psychological harm to an animal in legislation. The discussed definition tries to qualify the definition of harm, but with subjective terms unnecessarily or unreasonably, which gives the possibility of people having to constantly explain themselves, most likely in court, and that leaves many human-animal interactions wide open to subjective judgments. What would constitute psychological harm? There are many normal, everyday interactions we still have with animals that could be construed by some as cruelty. If a farmer has to yell at his sheepdog to correct it while herding sheep and the tail tucks in between the legs, is that abuse? If a horse needs to be broken in by making it wear a saddle it doesn't like, or to take a bit in its mouth for the first time, which also it doesn't like, would that be inflicting trauma? In horse racing, pushing a horse into a barrier and making them run for all their worth could be seen as doing psychological damage. The same for mounted police who condition their horses to cope with crowds and ride them in to prevent violent protests, which could be seen as psychologically damaging. Catch and release fishing could be said to be inflicting psychological harm on the worm, certainly, and on the fish. Where does it end? Is leaving your dog alone all day to suffer separation anxiety going to become a punishable offence? Do we fine a household where a family refuses to get rid of their cat because it terrorises their budgie? Do we ban loud music, power tools, cars, New Year's Eve fireworks because of the potential effect it might have on household pets? You can take the argument of psychological harm to a ridiculous extreme. Are we causing psychological harm by not stopping animals attacking or terrorising each other? Should we be teaching them to read and write so they can read the laws that apply to them, or even to talk so they can work out some of the psychological problems we've inflicted on them? Where are we drawing the line at our stewardship of the world's animals? Some interactions that might be construed as psychological cruelty have been around for centuries. Sections of our economy rely on interactions with animals that might come under the cloud of being psychologically harmful due to a subjective assessment. As human beings, we can think about what it is we are doing to other creatures and other people. Most people act with decency, but to punish the rest by imposing such a strict set of conditions will not make things better for animals that are already illegally tormented by people who generally show a disregard for the law and by extension a disregard for other people and animals. I'm all for improvements in legislation where it offers better protections for those who can't protect themselves, but this would not be an improvement. That is partly a result of the flawed consultation process. Several of the stakeholders who I've spoken to have told us their concerns, they were not listened to and they were not mentioned in the discussion paper. Preconceived ideas skewed the consultation process and blinded the review panel to the glaring problems with these changes to the existing law. For the sake of farmers, pet owners, horse riders and others who own or work with animals, we hope good sense will prevail and the government will abandon its plans to go down this dangerous path. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The question is that the House take note of the petition, and I call the member for Coffs Harbour.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise to make a contribution on this petition, and I note that it's been suggested that this bill is sponsored by the Minister for Agriculture and Fisheries and the Animal Justice Party. This accusation is far from correct, Mr. Speaker. This is a government bill. We know that animal welfare is an issue that the people of New South Wales take exceptionally seriously, which is why a key part of the animal welfare reform process has been and continues to be consulting with the community at multiple stages of the project. Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, let's focus on what members of the public have raised as their concerns as part of the petition and give the hunting, fishing and agricultural industries peace of mind. The government will continue to get on with the job of delivering for New South Wales. This government will continue to work with the community and key stakeholders to ensure New South Wales animal welfare legislation keeps pace with the latest animal welfare science, community expectations, industry practices and technology. The new bill has existing defences as exemptions and updates them to improve clarity on how they are intended to apply. The exemptions provide certainty to people undertaking lawful activities like fishing, hunting and pest management in appropriate ways that they are not committing an offence. The bill also amends the current defence for performing certain animal husbandry practices to allow the detail of these practices to instead be included in regulations so they can be more easily updated and changed if needed. Furthermore, this bill introduces new exemptions for live bait fishing and aquaculture to ensure that the inclusion of cephalopods and decapod crustaceans under the new laws has no unintended consequences for normal fishing and aquaculture practices. The Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Bill 2021 is a private member's bill. I'll just clarify that. The Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, Aquatic Animal Recognition Bill 2021 is a private member's bill brought forward by the Honourable Emma Hurst MLC and proposes to extend the definition of animal to include cephalopods and crustaceans at all times. It does not put forward the additional protections around fishing as proposed by the government's draft bill. This private member's bill is not supported by the government. Madam Speaker, I think it's important to just reiterate that they are two different bills. One is a private member's bill that is not supported by the government, and we have the government bill. Madam Speaker, can I put on the Hansard? Oh, I've said that part. Madam Speaker, I'd also like to address the member of Barwon's concerns about the powers of enforcement agencies. The draft bill proposes no changes regarding who can bring forward prosecutions under the new laws. These provisions have been carried over from the current laws where they've been in place since 2007. The enforcement agencies, including the RSPCA New South Wales and Animal Welfare League New South Wales Police, the Greyhound Welfare Integrity Commission and authorised officers from the New South Wales Government will continue to be able to commence prosecutions under these new laws. These groups have the powers under the new laws to investigate allegations of offences. These groups enforce animal welfare laws and run prosecutions on the basis they have both specialised skills and the knowledge of both animal welfare and judicial processes. This is nothing new. Animal welfare is an important issue for many in the community and is one that I and the government take very seriously. It is the government's intention to ensure that the new laws are robust, modern, fit for purpose for all who work with animals in New South Wales.
Madam Speaker.
Member for Campbelltown.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise to make a brief contribution. I thank the member for Barwon for his efforts and passion around this issue, as well as the many people who signed this petition on an issue that is very complex and very serious to so many people around our state, particularly those in rural and regional New South Wales. In the outset, we on this side of the House understand the importance of animal welfare. We also take very seriously the concerns that are expressed by community. But this petition process has been a good vehicle and conduit for the people of New South Wales and all the signatories to have their say and have this matter debated on the floor of the Parliament in the most important place where these decisions will be made. Quite considerably, Madam Speaker, the petition aims to address and express the many serious concerns and provide colleagues with the opportunity to express those concerns on the floor here in the Parliament. I do note the specifics of the petition, and I do accept that those views expressed are ones that come from a very sincere place by those signatories, of which we on this side of the House also take very seriously. I thank the House.
The question is that the House take note of the petition. I call the member for Albury.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I welcome the opportunity to speak to this petition debate, and I obviously, in that sense, do so from a perspective of a veterinarian of over 20 years and someone raised on the land in that regard. And I think we all recognise in that sense, I think what I would like to acknowledge is the importance of raising this important debate so that we are able to engage in discussion, dialogue in that regard. I think in that regard, what we are all genuinely concerned about is the welfare of animals. At the same time, we all want to ensure that those who do the right thing are not overburdened or penalised unnecessarily in that regard. I think in that sense, as a veterinarian, one of the things that I look at, one of the aspects that I look at was raised by the member for Barwon, and that's around having aspects of legislation properly defined. And I think in that sense, I think that's an important part of looking at any new legislation. At the end of the day, the whole debate around psychological suffering is in response to the need to provide clarity, because we currently have laws that imply a level of psychological suffering through the use of terms such as distress, tortured, tormented and infuriated. And when the member for Barwon talks about subjective judgments, those sorts of terms obviously are important that we seek to clarify what that actually means. I think it's important that we have the clarity around that. Likewise, obviously, when we use a term such as harm as an alternative to pain, I certainly understand as a veterinarian, and I'm sure everyone in this chamber would as well, that that welfare of an animal can be impacted on in so many other ways that don't necessarily cause pain in that regard. So you can have an animal locked up in a cage, you can have an animal confined, you could have an animal not fed. That is not necessarily going to cause pain, but we would all have a shared understanding that that would be something that could impact on the welfare of that animal. So I think in that sense, these are elements that at the end of the day we should be looking at as seeking ways of giving clarity. And in that sense, if I take a broader view, at the end of the day, what I'll note is that this petition is calling for the Assembly to withdraw and abandon the review process and for it not to proceed to legislation. I think in that sense, and I'll talk a little bit more about the consultation process, but at the end of the day, to the member for Campbelltown's point, it is on the floor of this House that we engage in that debate, that we make sure that the legislation that we are crafting is the best legislation that we can possibly put forward in that regard. So rather than abandon such legislation, let's bring it into the House once there is a bill that the government is prepared to put forward in that regard. And I note the member for Coffs Harbour drawing the distinction between the private member's bill, which the government does not support, and the consideration by government towards the need for a level of legislative reform in this space. I will speak in that sense around the consultation process, because that's an important part, and I think it's important to have visibility around that. The New South Wales government has had a priority of protecting the welfare of animals for a period of time now in that regard. In 2018, the New South Wales government released the Animal Welfare Action Plan 2018-2021, which committed government to modernising legislation that is almost 40 years old to deliver an animal welfare system that's focused on outcomes, and that one that reflects our evolving sense of animal welfare. And I think that's obviously a key point, that our understanding has evolved with time, expectations within community has evolved with time, and we need to ensure that we have fit-for-purpose legislation. With regards to the penalties, we need to point out was part of legislative changes in 2021 that went through the House. So again, any draft bill looking at reform to POCTA is not about increasing penalties, changing penalties, because that was something that was being addressed by Parliament previously in that regard. So, Speaker, I welcome the opportunity to engage in this debate. I think it's really important that we continue to look at how we can improve our animal welfare, understanding the right of those that do the right thing, that they're not having burdens placed on them unnecessarily. Thank you.
Speaker.
Thank the member for Albury. The question is that the House take note of the petition. I call the member for Orange.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank my colleague, the member for Barwon, for sponsoring this important petition. And I'd also like to thank and acknowledge the 22,656 signatories who oppose this National Liberal Government's backed push to introduce unnecessary and impractical animal rights legislation. At the outset, I share the views of my colleague, the member for Barwon, and I have no tolerance for any unnecessary harm to any animal. And that is why there are already existing laws in place and hefty penalties to deal with those few in our society who intentionally and unnecessarily harm animals, rather than expose the majority of law-abiding people in our community to falling foul of the proposed new laws. The lives of people living in the communities of rural and regional Australia are entwined with animals, be it animals they shepherd, animals they keep as companions or pets, animals they work, animals they cull, and animals they kill for sustenance. Human-animal interaction is a part of country life and an essential part of our primary industries and food chain. Mother Nature and the animal kingdom in and itself are cruel to animals as cruelty gets. Cruelty inflicted upon animals by other animals, including those living in the same herd or flock, involves harm by way of aggressive and cruel tendencies of animal species, be they wild or domesticated. Under these animal cruelty laws, a farmer would have the book thrown at him for marking or muzzling a sheep to prevent the sheep suffering inevitably from torture or fly strike, which is a proper definition of cruelty. That's a perfect example of the craziness of the extreme animal rights legislation. What are the parameters of psychological harm to an animal? The breaking of a horse to bit and saddle, the collaring of a dog to leash or chain, the process of forcing a worming tablet inside a distressed and resistant cat's mouth, the loading of sheep and cattle in a truck could all be determined as psychological harm under the proposed extreme laws. Even a grandfather threading a worm on his grandchild's fishing hook or holding his first fish caught for a photo before returning it to the water would be deemed as harm under the proposed new laws. In the National's Department of Primary Industries developed New South Wales Animal Welfare Reform discussion paper, which was the foundation document for the government-sponsored legislative change, I note the very limited group of stakeholders engaged in developing that document. The stakeholder groups were cherry-picked for what was a highly targeted stakeholder consultation process. Conspicuously absent from the shortlist are many farm and primary industry advocacy and representative groups. There was no input requested from the dairy industry, no input from the commercial fishing industry or hunting industries, no input from a long list of stakeholders whose livelihoods and life interests depend on human-animal interaction. Several of the targeted stakeholders actually engaged in the development of the discussion paper have reported to my Shooters, Fishers and Farmers Party colleagues that they felt ambushed at the outset of their involvement in the process. They felt railroaded in the process with their views being dismissed with no proper consideration or incorporation in the final document, which the government released in the dead of night. Essentially, the unholy National Liberal Alliance with the Animal Justice Party proposes to replace animal cruelty laws with an animal rights law. No wonder traditional National Party voters are looking further afield for their representation when the so-called representatives of farmers in rural Australia have quietly teamed up with an extreme left-wing party whose ultimate agenda is to outlaw any use of animals, except, of course, their Pomeranians, pugs and dachshunds, whom they dress in doggy clothes and gem-adored collars, which the dogs may probably feel psychologically distressed about wearing. We may laugh, but the reality is that psychological harm is subjective, and the interpretation of this law means that almost any human-animal interaction could be considered harm. The proposed new laws threaten the future of farming, fishing and other essential primary industries, let alone cultural traditions such as fishing and hunting, which are culture in this country for over 40,000 years. I cannot put it better than my colleague in the other place, the Honourable Robert Borsak, who said, and I quote, "The current laws are more than adequate and deal appropriately with cruelty offences when detected. Without healthy and happy farm animals, there cannot be healthy farming communities. Without those farming communities, there cannot be healthy city and suburban communities. It's that simple, and I commend the petition to the House.
Thank the member for Orange. The question is that the House take note of the petition. Member for Drummoyne. Are you seeking leave?
I'm seeking leave.
Member for Drummoyne is seeking leave to make a contribution. Is leave granted?
Thank you,
Leave is-
Madam
leave is
Speaker.
granted.
I feel compelled to say a few words as a metropolitan animal lover, because most of my colleagues are from regional. Most of my colleagues are from regional and rural New South Wales, and can I say that I commend the member for Barwon for bringing this petition to the House, and finding the right balance. Someone once said to me, if you want to get a friend in Parliament, you should buy yourself a dog. And I did that about 2.5 years ago. Actually, it was 1.5 years ago when the RSPCA did a promotion in this place, and I took home a cross German Shepherd Greyhound, and it's probably the best thing I ever did. I can almost say that I think I'm still here today because of the love for my dog, whose name is Dante. Yes. We treat my dog with the greatest respect and admiration, and I think most people, whether it's one of the similarities between owning a pet in regional New South Wales or metro New South Wales, apart from perhaps the work role it might take in regional New South Wales. But I think we've got to be really careful in the way we legislate and taking things to extreme lengths. And so this petition is sort of looking at that, at where do we draw the line. And I think often common sense is where we draw the line. And I don't think there'd be a person in this place that could endorse bad behaviour or cruelty to animals. It's just zero tolerance. And like the member for Barwon said, anyone that inflicts pain or suffering on an animal are usually the most heinous of people and would probably reflect that same behaviour towards other humans. So I think it's really important that we don't restrict, we draw the line at a sensible point. But I do want to commend all those that have signed the petition. It's a part of our democracy where we can actually get up here and debate certain things and pay respect to those that have actually done that. And that's why I find this petition part of the Parliament a crucial part of our democracy. As I said, you know, animals play an almighty role, whether it be from a pet point of view, a working point of view, or those that help those with disabilities or the aged. And I've found that my pet has done wonderful things for my family, and we treat him as if it was a child. And I think that's the general consensus by most people. We do have legislation in place, as rightfully said, that outlaws bad behaviour towards animals. I don't think we should take it too much further to the point where we then can't draw the line anymore. Where do you take it? To the point where, a dog is stressed because it's left by itself, or that you happen to raise your voice in an attempt to discipline. I just think, we can look at the reports, we can look at all the information brought forward, but what it needs is some common sense. And I think the member for Barwon has articulated and outlined the sensible response that we can look at further down the track. But I think anyone that goes down the path of cruelty to animals should be thrown with the full book of the law. It's unacceptable, and it just should not take place in this day and age.
Thank the member for Drummoyne. The question is that the House take note of the petition. I call the Minister and member for Dubbo in response.
Thank you, Speaker. Thank you. I thank the member for Drummoyne for his response, but what a load of rot. What an absolute load of rot. This is pure and simple scare tactics. Pure and simple scare tactics. Member for Orange just mentioned recruiting a left-wing party. You had to recruit a Labor Party member to speak today because you punted the member from Murray. What was her thought on this? Seriously.
Is that all you've got to say?
Seriously.
Order.
As you well know,
Member for Bankstown.
as you well know, all of these scenarios are dealt with in the current bill. This draft bill, draft being the operative word, is to deal with some clarity around some of the scenarios that people are now talking about. It's clarifying the existing bill. I've already taken out one whole part of the bill because it was completely unnecessary. But a draft bill is then consulted on. So it's drafted and then it's consulted on. There's a committee that will oversee that. It's starting its public consultation now. So would you have that not happen? Would you have that not happen? I mean, I completely agree. I think we all agree that animal welfare is really important. But what the member for Barwon is suggesting is that, in fact, we should limit community consultation. So don't use the draft bill. Just do nothing. This was brought in by the former Minister for Agriculture. It was brought in to clarify existing terms and clarify what other jurisdictions already use in that place. So this is not a brand new way of dealing with things. This is clarifying what we already have in place. And seriously, it's another attempt to throw up scare tactics. Hunting and fishing, they're already exempted. You know that. They are not in the bill. They've been exempted. You don't have to apply for an exemption. They are exempted. So are all animal husbandry practices that are within normal bounds. So there's nothing in there that changes. People can still do sheep handling, cattle handling, pig handling, fishing, hunting, normal practices. So I'm just worried that what you're doing is specifically to try and create a problem for people. And I understand people have genuine concerns about what this might mean specifically for them. But that's what consultation's about, and there is no change to normal behaviour in any way, shape or form. There's been 6,000 responses as far as the 2 rounds of public consultation. That's not nothing, 6,000 responses, and there will be more now through the committee that's been set up in Parliament to actually go through the process and provide a clear pathway forward. So let's let the process do what it should do, rather than trying to create scare tactics that all they do is alarm people.
The question is that the House take note of the petition. I call the member for Barwon in reply.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank the members for Coffs Harbour, Campbelltown, Albury, Orange, Drummoyne and the Minister, a member for Dubbo. I'd like to address some comments from the members for Albury. I'd like to thank the member for Albury for his sincere approach and agree that definitions are very important. Regarding consultation, the feedback we've had from some peak groups is that didn't go well in terms of what made it into the discussion paper, and I'd like to suggest that maybe we need to go back to that consultation point with those peak groups and start there. Madam Speaker, the member for Drummoyne, when he got up to speak, I don't know if you noticed, but I certainly noticed when he started speaking about Dante, his whole demeanour changed. His face changed, his body language changed. He was very happy talking about his dog. And I can understand that. I guess I feel the same way about our pets at home. So that was, I guess, what this is all about, making sure we can continue to have those human-animal interactions that are so important to us in our well-being and not place them at risk. To the Minister, look, I would say that getting up and saying that this is a cheap shot or this is a scare tactic, I totally disagree. When you read the discussion paper and we're worried about the psychological suffering of octopuses, you know, I reckon an octopus with a hook in it probably isn't too happy, you know, but I don't know how else you want to get it out of the water. In regards to, I think, consultation, we need to go out and start again. Start again. Get back to consulting with the peak groups. And what I would say that I am doing, Madam Speaker, is I'm protecting farming, I'm protecting the way of life that we enjoy in the West, interacting with animals.
Member for Tubbo.
Well, it's a subjective assessment. So no one wants to see cruelty, but thinking that allows a subjective assessment of psychological harm threatens sports and hobbies that involve animals, agriculture, fishing, hunting and pest eradication. That is the wrong balance. Existing laws make cruelty illegal and allow for prosecution. Let's not make it harder for farmers, fishers, horse enthusiasts, greyhound racers and domestic pet owners. Government's memory is short. Greyhounds took scalps and seats. It seems we are here again. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank the member for Barwon. The question is that the House take note of the petition. I'll put the question. All of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.